righty. I will turn it over to you now, Joel.
Great. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Welcome. And the reason I wanted to start with that clip is that we are going to be talking about memory and how memory gets established. And let me share my screen now. Let's see. Can I, I'm seeing one participant can share at a time. Here we go. Okay, but I'm not getting, sharing.
Should be able to share.
Okay. Oh, sorry, everybody. We'll get this going in a second. I'm just trying to, I'm not seeing it under share screen. There we go. Okay, sorry. Okay, fantastic. Here we go. Okay. So where I want to start off is I want to start off by talking about memory. And I want to start by talking about, just for a moment, by recognizing the passing last week of Lou OTTENS. Lou OTTENS played an enormously important role in my life through high school and college as I prepared cassette tapes of music to listen to in dorm rooms, for parties, sharing with friends. And part of what he enabled was a certain kind of portability of memory. And much of what Kiddush is about, as we're going to see today, is about memory. So let's talk a little bit about how human memory works. And in a minute, you'll see why I think that this is relevant for our topic today. What is memory? Memory is the faculty of the brain by which data or information is encoded, stored, and retrieved when it's needed. It's the retention of information over time for the purpose of influencing future action. If past events couldn't be remembered, it'd be impossible for us to talk together, have relationships, develop a personal identity. And memory is often understood as an informational processing system. The two main parts of memory that are known to lay people like myself are the short-term working memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory encodes memory for later retrieval, while the function of long-term memory is to store data through various models of categorization. And as we all know, all of you out there, especially those of us who are aging, and that includes all of us that are alive at the moment, because we're all aging, memory is not a perfect processor, and it's affected by many factors. And so as a result, we have to pay attention to how memory gets encoded, how we're able to facilitate it, and the ways by which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved, as we all know, can be corrupted. I want to introduce one other sort of framing device before we turn to Kiddush itself, and that is the idea of memes. So we may have seen the word memes, we may know what memes are, but just as a kind of overview of what a meme is it's an idea, a behavior, or a style that spreads by means of imitation from person to person within a culture, and it often carries symbolic meaning, representing a particular phenomenon or theme. And a meme acts as a unit for carrying cultural ideas, symbols, or practices that can be transmitted from one mind to another through writing, speech, gestures, rituals, or other phenomena that can be copied. And among the kinds of memes that there are things like are various kinds of practices that people do And the way in which they get learned and they get transmitted is that we see people do things. And when we see people do things, say like a fist bump, has been kind of a cultural meme over the course of the last 20 years. It started in basketball and then transmitted and then has mutated, so you can now find it in all parts of the world. And one of the best kinds of memes that we have are rituals. Rituals are replicated, copied, interpreted, changed. And because religions interpret them, they become the symbolic bearers of information, ideas, values, stories, and myths from a culture. So I want to refer for a moment just to two of the most successful transmitters of memes in the last 25 years. One, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of course, has been imitated by hundreds of thousands of followers. Various kinds of actions that he's done, that he taught about, have all been copied. Another one, Kim Kardashian. The people follow all kinds of things that she did. Believe me, it took me a while to find a modest picture of Kim Kardashian. But the reason that I wanted to refer to both of these figures is that when famous people do things, people take notice. Now, in ancient memory systems were things like repetition. Before the Talmud became written down, there were the way in which Jewish law was communicated is people repeated the laws, and there were people called Tanaim who memorized enormous bodies of Jewish law. So simply by reciting and repeating, what becomes the next modality of memory? Writing things down. And the first form, of course, were scrolls, and then books were invented. And imagine the convenience of being able to open up a book where you can flip around back and forth to the end, to the beginning, to the middle, go back and look at things without having to sit there and scroll through a long document. In the previous century, we had various kinds of recording devices that were created. Cylinders, LPs, cassette tapes, film. And now, how does most memory work? Well, when we go to buy a new phone or we buy a new computer, we want to know how many gigabytes we're going to get. We want to know how many terabytes we're going to get. I noticed that on my external hard drive the other day that I've only got 0.8 terabytes left. Terrifying. Only 0.8 terabytes left on my external hard drive. But coming back to our topic is the way in which much of Jewish memory has worked is through ritual. And it works not just through books, not just through recitation, not just through liturgy, but also through the gestures and rituals and the performance that accompanies them. And so what we're going to be talking about today is the ritual of Kiddush. And by the end of today, you will all understand why we hold a Kiddush cup like this, with our right hand being supported by the left hands. We will understand some of the words that are accompanying it, some of the other laws that come with it. But my emphasis today, because much of the general information is readily available about Kiddush, is going to be on the mystical aspects. But we can't go straight there. So we're going to start at the very beginning, and that is with the biblical verse that says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kadsho, remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. Well, how do you remember it? When do you remember it? Every day? Every hour? Do you set a reminder on your in your calendar to tell you to remember the Sabbath day? Do you just remember it on Fridays, Friday night, Saturday morning, the golf course? So what the rabbis explained in the Talmud, in PESAHIM 106a, and I'm just going to, I've prepared the Hebrew and Aramaic sources for you, but I'll just be reading the English for the sake of time. The sages taught, remember the day of Shabbat to sanctify it. Remember it over wine through the recitation of Kiddush. And I have only derived that there's a mitzvah to recite Kiddush during the day, as the verse is referring to the day of Shabbat, right? It says, remember the day of Shabbat. From where do I derive that one must also recite Kiddush at night? The verse states, remember the day of Shabbat to sanctify it, which indicates that one should remember it as soon as it is sanctified. The Talmud goes on for a long discussion to talk about whether the nighttime is more important or the day is more important, and they conclude, of course, that the nighttime is more important, but that it's also important to do it during the day. And it's from here that we learn how are we going to remember something that we too, like those ancient pre-rabbinic figures, will remember Shabbat by reciting words over it. And by saying certain words, there's a certain kind of muscle memory that will accompany that gesture, that ritual, and that will help to root certain kinds of symbolic values, cultural values, and other symbols into our minds that get watched by our kids, by our grandkids, by siblings, etc., to instill and concretize these things into our being. Now, the next text that I'm showing you right now, this is from Maimonides, the Mishneh, his great code of Jewish law, the laws of Shabbat, chapter 29, right near the very end of this long section of Jewish law. And here he says, it's a positive duty, it's a positive commandment to express the sanctity of the Shabbat day in words. For it is written, remember the Sabbath day to make it holy. That is to say, remember it in terms of praise and sanctification. One should remember it at its beginning and its conclusion by reciting Kiddush when Shabbat begins, Havdalah when it ends. Okay, so here's a kind of a brief statement of what it is that we're supposed to be doing, and there's a memory that's going to be taking place, which isn't exactly memory so much as it is a recording of significance, a declaration to ourselves and to whoever else might be listening. This is important. Pay attention. This is a holy day. It gets set aside from all the other days of the week. Now, moving along a little bit later in the chapter, just several laws later, he says that the basic parts of the Kiddush are one recites the blessing on the vine, Bore Pri Hagafen, and then one recites the Kiddush, the actual blessing part. But, he says, it is a custom that is spread to all of Israel to read from the beginning of the section, Vaychulu, and he completed. This is from the second chapter in Genesis that describes the very beginning of it, but it's really the end of the first chapter where it talks about the 6 days of creation. And then it says, and God completed the creation. And for anybody who has seen a traditional Kiddush, and I would assume that that's many or most or even all of you, that you're familiar, that we begin with Vayichlu Hashemayim Ba'aretz V'chol Tzva'am, and then we recite the blessing on the wine, and then comes the Kiddush part afterward. Now, let me just say something I should have said at the beginning about Maimonides. Maimonides is the most influential figure in Jewish law. He's actually the most influential figure in Jewish philosophy. And when I begin my classes in medieval Jewish philosophy, I always say the Rambam, Maimonides, he's the man. He is the one that was the most influential figure after Moses on the entirety of Judaism. So while I'm not presenting a whole series of statements from Jewish law, Maimonides ends up being the baseline for much of what follows. So where I want to turn now is to the 10 requirements that the Talmud enumerates for the cup. But Julie, you suggested that perhaps we take questions between different sections?
Yeah, Yeah, so do you want to stop the share for a moment and we'll see if there are questions?
Sure. Let me, whoops, hold on a second. How do I do that?
I got it.
Oh, you got it. Okay,
So,
thank you.
So folks, you can put your question in the chat box, or if you'd like to ask your question, use the raise hand function, or let me know in the chat that you'd like to be unmuted. So James Benchimo?
Yeah, my question. Hi, Joel. My question is, you do the blessing on the wine, and then the Kiddush. When do you drink? After the Kiddush?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And then what happens is on Friday night, there's an idea that one's supposed to share the wine from that cup with the people that are seated at the table. And in my home, we practice safe Kiddush. So we, I will usually pour it out of my Kiddush cup, and everybody can pour a little bit out.
Melissa? Melissa, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for this. Just when you think you know stuff, you realize how little you do know. I do know the difference between the vine and the Kiddush prayer, but I'm not sure if everyone does. And I think that you're kind of assuming that everyone does. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could recite the prayers for us.
That's a great idea. Let me, I've got a bunch of material that I'd like to get through. And so let me do that at the very end, okay? In fact, I had a kind of a mini form of that in mind at any rate. So
yeah, that's a great idea.
Thanks for asking for that.
And Joel, also someone asked if you could demonstrate how to hold the Kiddush cup. So perhaps those two questions could go hand in hand, so to speak.
Totally.
Okay.
We will take one more question if there's one more question right now, and then if there are more, then we'll take them at the next stage.
Robin.
Hi, thank you for taking the question. Could you just address the relationship between wine and our ancient people? Just how, what do we know about when wine became part of our culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. Already in the Bible, the grape is mentioned as one of the central fruit, one of the main fruits that were going to be found in the land of Israel. And in ancient cultures, wine was the basic drink. It was, to a certain extent, it was a kind of a luxury, but through much of the medieval period, it was safer to drink wine than it was to drink water, simply because water could get contaminated fairly easily. And so it became established as both a basic drink, but also as a drink by which one would mark special occasions. And so we find in virtually every Jewish festival that we have, we're using wine in one way or another. And we're going to see more about the meaning of wine in just a few minutes. So I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Let's see here. How did I do this again? Oh, there we go. Right. Okay. So one of the things that people may not be as familiar with is that the Talmud actually refers to 10 different requirements for a cup. And the cup that we're seeing here is actually the ideal kind of cup, as emerges in much of Jewish law, and then Kabbalistic thinking, Jewish mystical thinking, and Hasidic thinking, as opposed to the kind of cup that I've got, which has a leg, but this one's fine too. At any rate, let's take a look and see what the Talmudists have to say here. And here from the very first tractate of the Talmud, we have the statement that Rabbi Zera said in the name of Rabbi Abahu, and some say it was taught in a Breita. It's a certain kind of legal statement. 10 things were said with regard to a cup of blessing. This applies to the cup of Kiddush. It requires rinsing and washing. It should be undiluted and full. It has to be adorned and wrapped. One takes it in one's two hands and places it in the right hand and lifts it one handbreadth from the ground and fixes one's eyes upon it. Okay? Now, you'll find these days that some people do some of these things. Some people don't do, we'll just do one or two of these things. Not everybody, these are not so widely practiced. And one of the things that I found interesting when I was looking for pictures today is I found a picture of a chassid who was not following some of these in his demonstration of how to make Kiddush. And not to say that that was a mark of ignorance so much as to say that not all of these Talmudic laws are being practiced. And here we see some of them again being repeated in Maimonides. And he says, how does one do it? How do you make Kiddush? One takes a cup that holds a revi'it or more. How much is a revi'it? A revi'it means a quarter. A quarter of what? A quarter of a log. Well, that doesn't help you much either, does it? So what a revi'it is it's around three ounces. And there are disputes, of course, between different authorities. You can get as big as a 5-ounce revi'it. You can get as little as a 2.5 ounce revi'it. But generally, you take a cup that can hold about 3.5 ounces. So it's not very much. I mean, it's really, it's a very small cup. You rinse it on the inside, wash it on the outside, fill it with wine, and then you hold it in your right hand and lift it a handbreadth or more from the ground. And one does not assist the right hand with the left hand. One drinks enough to fill one's cheek and then gives all the members of the group to drink. Okay, so if you want to make sure that you're doing this right and fulfill all of the rules of etiquette, you have to be very careful how you're sloshing the wine around and as you're checking to see if you're getting your cheek full when you're making Kiddush. You might want to practice before to make sure that you're getting your cheek full and you know how much to be putting in your mouth. But kidding aside, what we're seeing is that on the one hand, there's a certain amount that's required for the cup and a smaller amount for the actual fulfillment of the mitzvah. Let's switch gears. What I want to do now is before we take a look there, is we're going to be looking at some texts from the Zohar. The Zohar is the central and canonical text of Jewish mysticism. It was mostly written in the 13th century, has had an enormous influence on Jewish thought and on Jewish practice, partly because it was traditionally believed to have been written in the 2nd century by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai during the 12 years that he was hiding out in a cave, hiding out because of the slanderous comments that he made about the Romans. And I was blessed about 10 years ago with the opportunity to participate in the translation of this book. It came out as 12 volumes from Stanford University Press. We're going to be reading from a piece right now that comes from the very end of the Zohar, from a section called the Ra'aya Mehemna, Faithful Shepherd, which was actually written a little bit later, probably the beginning of the 14th century. And he goes through these 10 requirements. I'm not going to read all of them that he's got, simply because there's a lot of different things that I want to cover today. But what he's going to do is provide some of the ideas behind this practice, or these practices of these 10 requirements. So he starts off third. Why third? What we're coming in the middle of is a section of mystical table etiquette, of the various kinds of practices that a Kabbalist, that is a Jewish mystic, would want to be doing at their meal in order to fulfill certain kinds of mystical requirements and to have an impact on the cosmos, have an impact on divinity, to somehow bring together and unify the aspects of divinity that are commonly referred to as masculine and feminine aspects of divinity. It doesn't mean God has parts. God doesn't have parts, but there are ways in which we experience different aspects of God. And for the Kabbalists who are willing to recognize that sometimes we experience God as merciful, sometimes as judgmental, sometimes as incomprehensible. But there is a way in which we do feel, given the suffering, the violence that's in the world, that somehow God's unity is not fully experienced. Much of what the Kabbalists were about was trying to bring about a union of what they understood as 10 different aspects. So there were 10 rituals, 10 different parts of the meal, and this is the third one, having to do with a cup of blessing. And within this particular rule, there are 10 requirements from the Talmud: rinsing, washing, crowning, wrapping, fresh, full, etc. Receive it in one's two hands and place it in the right. One shall direct one's eyes upon it, raise it a hand's breadth above the ground. The Zohar continues. The way of mystery in the word cup is filled with the blessing of Yud and He and Vav and He. Okay, the unspeakable, the ineffable name of God. Now, this next word, the gematria, is the numerical value of a word. So, in ancient civilizations, and these days, to my knowledge, it's only Jews that still do this kind of stuff, but the Greeks did it, and other ancient peoples assign numerical values to letters. And as a result, a word not only had its semantic meaning, in other words, the basic meaning that it had, but based on the letters that a word had and the numerical values that they had, so an aleph was 1, a bet was 2, a gimel was 3, there would be a numerical value that's associated with it. Why do such a thing? That's not how we read texts, right? The reason that you do that is to construct metaphors. If you can take two words and see that they have the same numerical value, you can then say, oh, what's the relationship between these things? So in the same way that I might say my love is like a rose, and then you say, oh, well, that's not obvious, that's not apparent. And then I tell you, oh, well, my love is beautiful, and my love is delicate, and it's fragile. Hopefully it's not short-lived. It could also be a little bit thorny. Don't tell my wife Franny I said that. So there's, what we've done is we've taken two words that are not immediately, apparently related to each other and brought them together. If we take two words and find to have the same numerical value, that becomes a tool in the Jewish tradition to create a metaphor. So what we find, I'm going back to the text now, let me show you where, right over here. The gematria of the word kos is Elohim, is that name of God. So what it means then is that in some sense, when I'm holding this cup, that I'm holding God, I'm taking responsibility for God. And the soul is derived from there, coming from the name cup. This is as is written, Kos Yeshuot Esah, I raise the cup of salvations. That's a verse we commonly hear at Havdalah rather than associating with Kiddush. But I raise the cup of Yeshuot, which literally is salvations. And the Zohar goes on to say, what are the salvations? 5 fingers. So Now, why are they 5 fingers? I'm not going to go into that right now. It's going to become too technical and confusing, and this will be challenging enough. But what I want us to see is this association of the cup and God's name, and the notion that 5 fingers are somehow intimately related to that cup because of this verse that talks about Yeshua. Let me go a little bit further. They established regarding the cup that it requires rinsing and washing. Washing on the outside and rinsing on the inside. Secret of the matter, that its inside should be like its outside. So one who attains a soul from this cup, in other words, if we're getting an extra soul on Shabbat, which is one of the teachings from the Talmud, so such a person will have a soul that is pure inside and out. Only somebody who is pure on the inside and out is going to get that extra soul. So when the Torah in this book of Leviticus says he shall cleanse it and consecrate it, and there we're not talking about a cup for Kiddush, but the Zohar interprets it as cleansing on the inside and sanctification on the outside. And now here we're going to do something a little bit more difficult following these Zoharic associations. Just as a cup is not cleansed and sanctified inside and out without water, so too the soul's cleansing and sanctification inside and out does not occur without Torah, I should say without. Torah is very often compared to water. So again, in the same way that this cup needs to be washed on the inside and out with water, so too does my soul need to be somehow purified inside and out with Torah. And that's why Rabbi Gamliel in the Talmud said that whoever's inwardness is not like their outwardness may not enter the study hall. In other words, you had to be dressed properly. Now, he was a little bit of an elitist, and he was a rich guy who only wanted rich-looking people coming into the study hall. But he also had this value that at least they had to be good on the inside. There's a whole story in which the admission criteria got changed and the doors got thrown open. But what we're seeing is the way in which the Zohar is taking each one of these criteria and turning the simple ritual of Kiddush into a vehicle for thinking about what do we want to do with ourselves? How are we going to change ourselves, improve ourselves? What is this Kiddush trying to do for me? And I think we're going to, let me just do one more piece from that text, and then I'm going to stop for questions before we go into the next part, the next topic. We saw that one of the criteria that was required was to receive the cup in 2 hands. And if you go to the home of certain kinds of Haredim, certain kinds of Hasidim, very often a child will bring the Kiddush cup over to his father, or he will take it from the table once it's filled, and the father will have his hands extended like this, receiving it in 2 hands, just like that. So the text says, receiving it in his 2 hands, just like the Torah, which came as 2 tablets, 5 utterances on 1 tablet, corresponding to 5 fingers of the right hand, 5 on the second tablet, corresponding to the 5 tablets of the left hand. And they were given by the right, that is the right hand. Thus he, that is Moses, brought down 2 stone tablets in his hand, is what we say in our prayers, not in his hands. This is as is attested in scripture from his right hand, God's right hand, a fiery law for them. Okay, another difficult chain. Let me unpack this for you a little bit. So, and I'm going to start at the end, is because that's where they started. They started with this verse from Deuteronomy. In the poetic section near the end of the Torah, it refers to the Torah being given from God's right hand, which of course in most cultures the right is privileged. I'm a lefty, but so more power to us. But generally, Jewish ritual also privileges the right hand. And here we see that this idea that the Torah was given from God's stronger side, or better side, as it were, a fiery law. And because it's one hand that it comes from, ultimately the Kiddush should be said with one hand. But it starts off as two, because we know that the tablets, which are being represented by two hands with their 5 fingers, with their 5 utterances on each one of the tablets, is going to receive that cup. What are we doing? What's the Zohar trying to do here? Well, what it's trying to do is to transport us, is through our imagination, our imaginative performance of a ritual, is for us to imagine when we're saying Kiddush, that we're like Moshe, right? That like we're standing on Mount Sinai, we're receiving the Torah. That before, in the previous part, we saw that the cup was like God. Well, now it's like the entire Torah. It's like the 10 Commandments. And so again, we're in this position where we are taking responsibility for, and we are receiving the entirety of the Torah. And we are engaging with it in this intimate way as we are looking upon it. Let's see, is that, yes, that's the last part. Let me just say that I referred before to the masculine and feminine parts of divinity, of God. And I'm not going to go into the Kabbalistic details there, but this notion that there is a Shekhinah, that there's a feminine presence, a feminine aspect, is a central feature of Jewish mystical teaching. A great deal of attention is devoted in prayer, in Torah study, in ritual to the Shekhinah by these. They were all male Kabbalists writing a male tradition. It is, of course, a challenge to find feminist ways to spin this, to find queer ways to spin this. But for our purposes today, that the way that the Zohar talks about the Kiddush cup is as the feminine presence, so that when we are asked to gaze upon it, it is our attention that we are being asked to devote loving attention to the Shekhinah, to that feminine aspect of God. Okay, let me stop for a moment to take, I'll take 2 or 3 questions, then we'll move on. Thank you.
Great. There were a few questions in the chat box, which I will ask. So is there a connection between Kosi Revaya, my cup hath run over, and Kiddush? Great,
okay, wonderful question. So you will find, particularly if you go to the home of Chabad Hasidim, that when they pour the cup for Kiddush, that they will pour it in such a way that it overflows all over their hands. I mean, they don't waste a lot, you know, but they're wasting like, I don't know, 1/4 of an ounce, a 1/2 an ounce, but it's noticeable. And and the idea, of course, is to have the feeling on Shabbat that one has everything that one needs.
Great. So someone asked approximately when in our history did we start saying Kiddush on Friday night? They'd like to share with their kids how long our ancestors have been doing the same thing.
Terrific. So the Talmudic statement that I shared there is recorded in the 2nd century. Okay, so it's sometime before the year 200. We can't really pinpoint it much more than that, but it's probably sometime in the 100s that practice begins.
Great. Corey, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. A question about the physicality, which I appreciate. I think, you know, so much of our memories live in our bodies in addition to the ancient text. When it comes to holding the cup, is the physicality you described specific to Kiddush and Shabbat, or would we hold a cup the same way at other times? I'm thinking Havdalah or Pesach.
Totally. And there are, I mentioned that I'm a lefty. In much of Jewish law, there are accommodations made for lefties, and there are some places. So for example, with a lulav, I'm supposed to hold the lulav in my left hand rather than in my right hand, which is what most people do. However, with a Kiddush cup, and it's probably because I've studied the Kabbalistic emphases on this stuff, is there's greater emphasis on holding it in one's right. And so, like many lefties, I've got a certain amount of ambidextrousness. That's because culture discriminates against us, so we had to accommodate ourselves or adjust ourselves. And so I will hold it like this with the right, and then with support from the left, as I'll explain shortly. And in terms of physicality, thank you for that great opportunity to plug my first book, which was about embodiment in medieval Kabbalah. And it was very much about, what is the experience of the body as one is participating specifically in Jewish eating rituals, and the physical experiences I was trying to get at, or imaginative physical experiences of eating and drinking. So Julie, I think that we should probably go back, although I did see one one question in the chat that I'll answer, and that is one hand or two hands. So what the Talmud is prescribing is that somehow you receive it in two hands. So a child would bring it over, or somebody would place it in the hands of the person making Kiddush in the two hands. Whoops, this is why you need a flat cup. And then you transfer it to the right hand, and then support it with the left. Okay, let's go back to sharing the screen. And I will do that. Okay, so here we go. Number of words in Kiddush. Now, I talked about this practice of gematria, which is somewhat foreign to most Westerners or Easterners, for that matter, that are not already familiar with this. There's the number of words in certain prayers was given significance in the history of Jewish mysticism. And the way to think about this is to go back to the memes that I was talking about earlier. What are some Jewish numbers that are memes, that have, in other words, an idea that serves as a cultural vehicle for memory? The number 7, right? 7 days of the week. Not 7 days in a sabbatical. Number 10, 10 commandments, 10 utterances God created the world with. But beyond that, there's the number 12, like the 12 tribes. There's number 26, which corresponds to the numerical value of God's name. The number 70, there are 70 nations, there are 70 languages. Of course, there's more than that, but in the rabbinic imagination, the number 70 was a number of completion. Oh, of course, the number 40 is a number of completion. And the number 72, which emerges out of the Babylonian base 12 system, there's a 72-letter name of God, or 72 names of God. Now, we don't necessarily ourselves think in numerical terms in these same ways, but in the Jewish tradition, they do carry certain kinds of cultural values, so that, people that are, so that when you learn a piece of Talmud, say, or a piece of Midrash, or a piece of Torah, and it says 7, it's like automatically you think like, oh, 7 days of creation. Or you see the number 12 somewhere, and you'll think automatically, oh, 12 tribes. And there's supposed to be a kind of a pinball effect, where it's going bing, 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 bing every time you hit the flippers, that connects you to other ideas. So, whoops, there we go. Let's go on. So going to somewhere near the very beginning of the Zohar, the Zohar says there are 2 hallowings, or 2 sanctifications that we should recite. One is Vayechulu, which reads, and the heaven and earth were completed. The other is Kiddush. Kiddush is the other sanctification. Vayechulu contains 35 words, and in the Kiddush that we recite, there are 35 words altogether, amounting to 70 names of the Blessed Holy One. with which assembly of Israel is adorned. Okay. So, if anybody's, I should have said this at the outset, if you have a Siddur handy and you can find your Kiddush quickly, then you can count. And if you leave out the blessing of Borei Pri Agafen, the blessing on the wine itself, the grape juice itself, you'll probably find that your version of Kiddush has 42 words, not 35 words. Or it might have a different number of words. So what's going on here? So first of all, let's take a look at the text, and then we'll talk about the history of the number. The first is, we saw already in Maimonides that there's this paragraph from Genesis chapter 2 that we recite leading into Kiddush. The Zohar draws attention to the fact that there's 35 words there. And then in the Kiddush, again, omitting the blessing, it says that there are 35 words. 35 and 35, of course, is 70. And I mentioned 70 as one of these numerical means that has significance. 70 nations and 70 languages. And why 70? Because 70 connotes totality. It connotes everything. It's an allusion to an ideal of the total praise that one could have. And so if there are 70 words in Kiddush in which we are sanctifying the Sabbath and through which we are blessing God, and we are saying those 7 words over this cup, then there's a way in which what we are doing is we are trying to say this totality here. So we've now seen associations with this cup, with God, with the Shekhinah, the feminine aspect of God, with the 2 tablets that came down on Mount Sinai, with the entirety of the Torah. And now we're seeing with the fullest possible praise that could be given to God. The word assembly of Israel here is a name that the Zohar uses to refer to the Shekhinah. So it's saying that as if at a wedding, when a bride becomes adorned with all kinds of, with makeup and with, jewelry or what have you, that's what is taking place to this cup. It's as if we're treating the cup as a bride at the Friday night meal. Now, I mentioned that there are 42 words, not 35 words. So what's going on here? Well, there are different versions in the tradition of Kiddush, but one of the easiest ways to get there in the version that the Zohar presumably was referring to is what you might take as a kind of a proto-reconstructionist take on Kiddush. And I know that at least one of the graduates of our college is on this call, so that's a shout out to her. And the words Kivanu v'charta v'otanu kidashta mikol ha'amim, because you have chosen us and sanctified us from amongst all the nations, is Isaac Luria, the great 16th century Calvinist, says, don't say that on Shabbat. Now, he doesn't say, don't say that on Shabbat because he's a proto-reconstructionist, I'm afraid to say. He says, don't say that because that's for Yom Tov. That's for holidays. Shabbat is not about chosenness. But whatever the case may be, is that by eliminating those words, we get to the right number that we want to get to. Now, I'm looking at the time. I see we've got 5 minutes left, and I've got 45 minutes left of material left to deliver. But rather than strain your patience, what I'm going to do, I'm going to pass over this next text because I want to get to my end text. Just to draw attention to one thing here is, this is from another text in the Zohar, where it talks about how we get to 35, the significance of the number 35. It's the beginning of the second paragraph here, where it talks about 32 paths and 3 rungs of apples, according to the SEFER Yetzirah, the book of creation, the first Jewish mystical text. God created the world with 32 paths of wisdom, meaning 22 letters and 10 aspects of divinity, and 3 rungs of apples. Don't have time to get into that. But in Vayechulu, we refer to the name Elohim 3 times. So we have the paths of creation, 3 iterations, 3 utterances of the name Elohim. We get to 35 of the Vayechulu and the 35 of the Kiddush itself. Last text. This is from the very first page of the Zohar, although like most introductions, it was written later than much of the Zohar. And I'm going to read this text and just touch on a couple of points. This is in your packet. Rabbi Chizkiah opened, like a rose among thorns, so is my beloved among the maidens. Who is a rose? Assembly of Israel. For there is a rose, and then there is a rose. Just as a rose among thorns is colored red and white, so assembly of Israel includes judgment and compassion, 2 different attributes. Just as a rose has 13 petals, so assembly of Israel has 13 qualities of compassion surrounding her on every side. Similarly, from the moment Elohim God is mentioned, it generated 13 words to surround assembly of Israel and protect her. Then it is mentioned again. Why again? To produce 5 sturdy leaves surrounding the rose. These 5 are called salvation, Yeshuot. They are 5 gates. Concerning this mystery it is written, I raise the cup of salvations. This is the cup of blessing, which should rest on 5 fingers no more, like the rose, sitting on 5 sturdy leaves. Paradigm of 5 fingers. This rose is the cup of blessing. Now, to do this properly would take us another half an hour. We're not going to do that. But I would just want to draw attention to the chain of associations that we have here. And they are, that we started with the a rose being like assembly of Israel, which is Shekhinah, feminine aspect of divinity. And that we talked about some aspects of the rose. I talked about the rose earlier. The Zohar is talking about a specific kind of rose that has alternating red and white petals corresponding to compassion and to justice or judgment. And it has 13 petals corresponding to the time from the first mention of God's name to the second mention of God's name in the Torah. But ultimately, this rose is supported by 5 leaves, and it concludes by saying, this is like the cup of blessing, supported by these 5 leaves. So what I hope that the message that I would like us to leave with, and I'll recite the Kiddush in just a moment so that you can hear it, is that when we make Kiddush, that there's a way in which symbolically we are taking responsibility for the way in which God's experienced in the world, for the way in which we model our Jewishness, the way in which we model our spirituality. That in some way, it's not just the world that's in his hands, but rather the world is in our hands. And actually, in some sense, even God is in our hands. Shekhinah is in our hands. And so I hope for all of us, as hopefully the world starts to expand as we get vaccinated, and we get to go out again and to be with people and to experience the world more fully, that we can think about how we are bringing that spirituality into the world, and that in some sense that we have a responsibility for it. So I'm going to make Kiddush. I'm not going to actually I'm not going to say God's name because it's not Friday night, but I'll model it for you. I'm just going to say seated, though normally I would stand and then sit. And I hold it like this with the right hand, which symbolizes the side of compassion, supported by the side of judgment, supported by justice, because we need both, but we want love to be dominant. And we say, Yom HaShishi, Vayechulu Hashemayim V'Haaretz Kol Tza'am, Vayichalel B'Yom HaShvi Melachto Asher Asa, Vayishpot B'Yom HaShvi Mikol Melachto Asher Asa, Vayirachim Yom HaShvi Vayikadesh Oto, O Shabbat Mikol Melachto Shebara Elohim V'Asot. Sabri Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Borei Pri Hagafen Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, shekitzanu mitzvotav v'atzavanu, shelakodsho b'yahava v'ratzon yichilanu zikron ma'aseh reishim, tchila l'mikrei kodesh, zecher yitzat mitzrayim, v'shabbat ha'kodesh yahava v'ratzon himchotanu. Baruch atah Hashem mekadesh HaShabbat. L'chaim. I know that our time is up, but I'm happy to stick around for a little bit if people have questions.
Okay, we can take a couple of questions. Let's see. Someone had asked, I think this was answered in part in the chat, but maybe you wanted to address it as well. What's the connection between Kiddush, Kaddish, Kadosh, and how do we not confuse them?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. The way you don't confuse them is by practicing. Practice makes perfect. But they're all derivative from the same root of kuf daled shin, of kadosh, which means holy or sanctity, and all of them are different ways of. There are three different parts of liturgy actually with that root in them. One of them is Kiddush, which we've been talking about. The other is Kaddish, which is or Kaddish, which is mostly familiar to people as the mourner's Kaddish. But the truth is that mourner's Kaddish doesn't emerge until the early 13th century as a practice. Essentially, it's a liturgical unit that marks the end of one section of prayers and before the beginning of the next section of prayers. In fact, and as for too many of us who have had to say Kaddish, or at least have had the privilege to say Kaddish, that there's no reference to the den. It is simply a praise of God. It is a way of praising God. And the third piece of liturgy is the Kedusha, which is part of the repetition of the statutory prayer at the morning service and the afternoon service, in which there are various verses that are recited in call and response from the prayer leader. Next question.
Any other questions? Someone had a question in the chat about the word kos and the word for soul, maybe neshama. Is there a relationship? She had learned that there's either a relationship, maybe with gematria or something else, between the word for cup and the word for soul.
Yeah, great. So that was something simply that the Zohar asserted. It said, oh, the soul comes from Elohim, right? The soul comes from God, and more technically it referred to the name Elohim as it's referring to the Sphira called Binah, which is a higher feminine aspect of divinity. And then because of the equation of Kos and Elohim, it was able to make that link. So it's a two-step association.
Let's see. Can you address the Kiddush and gender issue? Someone asked, do men and women make Kiddush? And why is a man responsible and not the woman? I guess this is from certain perspectives, but can you share any insight in that?
Yeah, totally. Is actually in the laws of Shabbat apply equally to men and women, according to Talmudic law, and so that if you open up the Code of Jewish Law that was written by Yosef Karo 400 years ago, it says both men and women are obligated to hear Kiddush. Both men and women can make Kiddush, and though the patriarchal expressions of Judaism have, and of most of history, have made it such that we expect that it's going to be men that are going to be making Kiddush. That's just not, that's not a requirement according to Jewish law.
Okay, great. And we'll take one more question from Carolyn, and then I have a couple of announcements at the end.
Okay.
So my question goes back to when you're reading the section about the 5 fingers, or chamesh etzbaot, and chamesh was written hey with a little chip chip,
Yeah.
which is another way that we refer to God's name. So could it be read as God's fingers?
Oh, that's great. I like that a lot. So the that's a is here's what I don't know to answer that question is when you look at I spent a fair amount of time reading medieval manuscripts before there was printing, and the normal way in which those manuscripts go to short form for God's name was as Yud and Yud. I have a hunch that using the letter Hey as an abbreviation is a later form, that it emerges later than what the Zohar was talking about. But I love it. I love the suggestion, anyways. So I opened up our talk today by talking about memes, right? Is what happens with memes is that it's not like a Japanese tea ceremony or perhaps it is like a Japanese tea ceremony in which things get repeated as much as possible. Truth is that we do try to repeat it so much as possible, but inevitably there are changes that creep in, and there are new interpretations that creep in. And I'd say, Carolyn, when you're making Kiddush this Friday night, go for it.